I'm going to introduce our guest tonight. First of all, our first guest is McKenzie Fetters. She's the Illumify Audiobook Coordinator. McKenzie, why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Okay, just recap. I'm McKenzie. I worked at Illumify for a little over 2 years. I assist Mike with some marketing materials, and I'm also the audiobook coordinator. So some of you may have corresponded with me over email about what it might take to turn your books into an audiobook. And also, I was just going to say, I have worked with John Behrens, who is our other guest tonight. He is president, owner, founder at Nashville Audio Productions, which is an award-winning studio based in Nashville, Tennessee. And I have worked with them to produce over 7 audiobook titles that are on Audible. So I have experience in that realm as well. And yeah, happy to be joining tonight and talking to you all.
Great. Well, John, why don't you introduce yourself now?
Sure, yeah. John Behrens. About 6 years ago, I founded Nashville Audio Productions after working in the field for about 5 years before then. Came to Nashville to do music production and found myself doing this as well. And yeah, we've produced, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of titles, and have enjoyed connecting with Illumify via McKenzie, who has done a fun array of things for us over the years, but she's a fantastic narrator in her own right. And I narrate as well. I coach narrators, I develop proofers, and yeah, I've worked in every aspect of the process for about 10 years now and about 6 years with the company, and worked for HarperCollins, Macmillan, all the top folks. And so it's great to partner with Illumify because I like to work with folks who want to work at that level. And it's great to work with folks who share that value, caring about the quality of what we put out.
Great. So John, why don't you tell us, first of all, what inspired you to get into audiobooks?
Mostly just the opportunity to do it. It was work, and I was just called in to start engineering sessions. And then as things happen, the producer who was supposed to be producing was not really producing. And so I found myself really doing almost every part of the process and came to really like it. And then when the opportunity came to start Nashville Audio Productions, I found that I really enjoyed expanding those roles into developing narrators, connecting with publishers and authors. And yeah, I wouldn't say I was inspired on the front end to get into it, but as I got deeper into it, I found that I really, really enjoy helping people bring their babies into a new form. It's what I do for music production, just in a slightly different form, but it's that same core joy of being trusted with someone's creation and helping them bring it out into the world with excellence and according to their vision, and helping them refine that vision, cluing them into the questions they don't know to ask, and sort of watching them light up with ideas. And then I love leading a team. We've got, 50 or 60 narrators and a whole team of post-production editors and QCers. And it's just really fun to develop people and connect with those who also want to do excellent work. So again, it wasn't so much inspiration on the front end, but those are the things that I've derived a lot of joy from.
Well, and I'll mention I was in Nashville a month ago and met John, got a tour of the studio and where he does his work. And I asked, well, anybody famous recorded here? And he said, well, Taylor Swift, her background vocals for which album was it that was recorded there?
Fearless.
Yeah. So, but they've had other people too have recorded there. So it was interesting, even seeing the setup of where you sit, where the microphone is. You read off of an iPad so that people can't hear you turning the pages. I found it very interesting. But I'm going to start off with a kind of a big picture question, another big picture question. Tell us about the process. Like what happens? How does it work from beginning to end? What does it look like?
Yeah. You can kind of outline it in a timeline. It starts with pre-production, which is taking a look at the manuscript, obviously getting a quote, kind of discerning how much studio time are we going to need, but then particularly looking up pronunciations so that you know in advance how to say tricky words, and then whatever visual elements there are, how do we adapt those to audio smoothly so that the listeners have a good experience? How do we make graphics available on a downloadable PDF if there's things that you can't talk out? So there's pre-production, then there's the recording itself, which often happens in our studio that you got to tour, Mike. But we've got multiple options for that. We have a mobile kit we mail around the country. We find studios close to people if they're somewhere in the country that's too far to come realistically to Nashville. So you prepare, you do the recording itself, and then it goes into post-production where you take that recording, you do an initial edit and export it, and then you have a proofer or QC where they will listen to the entire audiobook while following along on the manuscript. And anything that slipped by the narrator and the director during recording, they'll catch. If you're doing fiction, if a character voice changed over time and nobody caught it, anything like that, you get that round of quality control. And then you'll do some edits. You might bring the narrator back in to record fixes, and then you'll master it to the specs for distribution, and you'll send it out. And then the final step is the distribution itself, which almost always is handled by a third-party distributor. There's enough outlets that people buy audiobooks from that it's better to harness someone who does that for their living to get it out to Apple and Google Books and Spotify and Audible and library sites and all of that. But yeah, it starts with pre-production, goes all the way through to those masters being handed off to the distributor and sent out to the world.
So at what place in the process, what places in the process is the author involved, especially if they're paying for the audiobook? Where are they involved in the process?
Yeah, for sure in the pre-production. That is the place where we get to apply our expertise in how to make audiobooks at a high level and sort of draw out from the author, what's your vision? How do you want to translate these things to audio? Here's our recommendation, but what do you want to do? How does this work for you? We'll ask about bonus materials. Often we'll record interviews or things like that. Perhaps scrape audio from a video or a podcast and put that in as a bonus. All of that kind of vision for the production, that happens in the pre-production phase. And then once that's done, if the author is going to read it themselves, then we'll give them the prepped annotated manuscript. We'll coach them during the recording and all of that. If they're going to go with a pro narrator for any of a number of good reasons, then their role is pretty much done, because once we have the vision from them and clarity on specifics, then we go and do what we do. So our goal is to involve authors basically as much as they want to be involved, especially in the vision for it, and then try to minimize the footprint on them so that they can keep doing what they're good at. We can go do what we're good at. And unless something comes up where we need their approval or their input, we're going to try to not take up their time for the rest of the process.
Now, I want to come back to narrators in a little bit, but like when you have an audiobook how is a nonfiction audiobook different from a fiction?
That's a good question. Nonfiction is going to generally be a conversational tone, and you're not going to be getting into character voices or much dynamics of delivery. I always tell people your goal is to feel like you're sitting on the couch next to me, just reading the book to me, or just talking about something you're interested in. So you're engaged, but you're not dramatic. Whereas fiction is where almost universally you're going to employ a professional narrator with significant acting skills, because that's where you get into both the dramatic narration, and you need someone who can perform different voices, delineate characters, do them consistently, and convey the emotions of whatever's going on in the book. And that is where you need someone with training and experience.
So a person can't just record their audiobook themselves in their closet and think it's going to come out okay?
You can, and it might come out okay, but there's a lot more going on. And anybody who has come in and recorded with us or tried to do it themselves, you realize pretty quickly that there's a lot more that goes in. all the way down to just keeping yourself consistent with the microphone so that the tone doesn't vary. And there's a lot of small details there. That's why I always push people, if possible, to come into our studio or to a studio near them with audiobook experience, because then you have an engineer and a coach right there who can guide your delivery, who can call out if you're moving around, if your clothing is rustling, all these little details that separate something that was obviously recorded in your living room on a USB mic from something that sounds like all the major market stuff that's out there.
So now let's talk about narrators. What are the pros and cons of using a narrator? And I want to hear from you, but also want to hear from McKenzie after you, John.
Sure. Yeah, in general, these days, listeners like to have the author read their own book when it's nonfiction, especially anything memoir related. A lot of people that we're working with have brands that incorporate them as podcasters or speakers. And so there's cognitive dissonance if you've got a pro narrator speaking as though they're this person, but you know this person's voice. So over the last 8 years or so, I've seen the tide turn to where the expectation is authors generally are reading their own titles when it's nonfiction. The con of that is that it is a learned skill and it's a craft. And so you just need to set yourself up for success with that and involve coaching and direction as much as possible to get the best out of you, so that your delivery is not going to turn people off, even though it's you reading it. And the pros of hiring a narrator is the actual delivery is almost always better. This is what they do. They're very good at it. So depending on the topic and who you are and all of that, that may overwhelm the pro of your voice being the voice saying these things. And that's part of what I help people figure out. Is this a good fit? And I'll do a test read with them before we even settle on the plan, because being able to read aloud without messing up the words on the page, it's not an inherent skill. It feels like it, but it's just not. And so we help people evaluate that. Is this something that's going to bring you joy if you're going to spend 16 hours behind a microphone doing it? And then, yeah, if it's fiction, I'm only aware of a few authors who also have that skill set. So almost universally, if it's fiction, we focus more on, all right, let's talk about what kind of voice you want, what kind of characters, let's pitch different narrators, and you tell us which one you're resonating with, which one you want to be the voice for this.
So in fiction, do you use multiple narrators or do you use one?
It depends. Often you'll use multiple narrators. A lot of it depends on how the book is written. There's many books where underneath the chapter heading, it'll say the character who's the first person character of that chapter, and there might be multiple characters as the first person throughout the book. In that case, almost universally, you have a multicast recording. A lot of the fiction we've done is just one narrator who will just voice the different characters if it's kind of first person consistent through the book. Rarely will you do a true multicast recording where you're doing the lines of dialogue themselves like a radio drama would be, just because that's incredibly time consuming and expensive. It's a lot of fun, but it's very expensive.
I bet. Now when you're looking at, and continuing with the narrator thing, how do you go about selecting narrators for a book?
Well, depending on, so if it's nonfiction, there's two approaches. One is just finding somebody who sounds similar to the author. So you look at your basic casting requirements, age, sort of ethnicity, overall tonality. Are you bright? Are you kind of dark? So you try to find someone to match the author so that it's believable. It still resonates. If it's, and the other way you can cast is, I just want this to sound awesome. I don't care if it sounds like me, in which case I'll just try to tease out from someone, what do you picture in your head when you imagine this audiobook? Do you want a booming, authoritative sort of radio broadcast voice, or do you want like a really conversational, every man sort of voice, every woman sort of voice? So there's sort of two ways of casting a nonfiction book. When it's fiction, it comes much more down to who is this first person character. And a male author could write a book from the female perspective, and she might, he might be 35 and the character might be a 60-year-old woman in France, and so you're looking to find an older middle-aged woman who can pull off a great French accent. Not a hypothetical example in this case. So
Didn't even think about the French accent.
mm,
So okay. So what about? Oh, go ahead, McKenzie. Why don't you give us a little elucidation?
Absolutely. I was just going to say, as far as choosing a narrator goes, John, that's one of the processes or parts of the process where the author would have input, correct? Is where you would soft pitch them and say, okay, considering that your book has this background, this character, and you're looking for a professional narrator, I would recommend these people. And in the case that the author comes back and says, you know what, I appreciate it, but this isn't really what I'm feeling for my book, you'll come up with another set, correct?
yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's all about pulling out from the author. What is your vision? What do you want? And how do we find somebody who sounds like what you imagine in your head when you imagine your audiobook?
Exactly. And it's an incredibly intimate thing. I know I've listened to a lot of audiobooks, particularly there's a lot of celebrity memoirs where the celebrities will read them themselves. And it's a really different experience from just reading the book. Because again, like John said, it's conversational. It's like it's their voice, it's their story. But don't let that fool you and make you think that they're just pulling this out of nowhere. Like it is a practiced skill, like John mentioned. Having been in the studio recording audiobooks, it can be, it's a good amount of work. Like you'll be recording about 6 hours a day, usually, and it can be really tiring on your voice. It's also, you have to keep up your focus in order to keep the process flowing along. You are not allowed to make a mistake every sentence because that would take forever to have to re-punch back in all of that. So those are the kinds of things that John is talking about, where it's like, we'll do a sample read if someone wants to potentially narrate the book themselves. And sometimes it's a great fit. And other times it's like John said, you're the author, this is your baby, and we're going to have a professional who has trained for this, who is going to bring this to life in the most efficient manner, voice your book and bring it to the world, because it is a growing market, audiobooks. And believe it or not, people do get turned away if the quality is not there, if the voicing is not something that they agree with, if something about the narrator turns them off, then they will not read the book. The books do get returned. So just to add in a little note there about kind of why there's a selectivity in the process.
So McKenzie, how many hours, and I know you just said 6 hours at a time, how many total hours will typically go into narrating a book for a professional narrator?
For a professional narrator, John, you'll have to double check me here, but I would say the average book is around 300 pages, right? Something like that.
It depends. Fiction,
It really
you're looking
depends.
yeah. So generally, nonfiction, you're looking at 1.5 to 2 days in the studio, about 8-hour days, taking breaks and all of that. Fiction, you're looking at 3+ typically. Fiction can get very long, but typically fiction, you're looking at 3 days.
What if a person loses their voice in the middle of it or gets hoarse?
Hmm?
What do you
Oh,
do if a person loses their voice or gets hoarse?
or gets COVID, also not hypothetical. Then you
Yeah.
bump the time frame back and they keep checking in, and as soon as they're able to, you keep going. And if they can only do a couple hours at a stretch, then you do what you need to do to get it done. And if their voice is truly gone, then you recast it. And yeah.
And another note to add in there, sorry to cut you off, Mike, is that the reason they do the back-to-back sessions is so that whoever's reading it, recording the book, can remember the voices that they used, so that, there's an approximate, because also your voice changes from day to day. This example of people getting hoarse really does happen, but also I've listened to my own recordings, like books from a couple months ago, and then versus now, my voice has changed. So there's a reason that it's back to back, not just for efficiency, but also just for ease for the narrator and having continuity through the flow of the book.
Well, even the time of day, your voice changes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you wake up in the morning, until my voice is low up until about 10 o'clock in the morning, and then it starts to go higher. And then I get tired in the afternoon, it gets lower again. So there's a lot of nuances to this.
Yeah, and all of this that we're talking about speaks to the benefit of what's called directed sessions. Yes, you can buy a USB mic and record yourself at your home, but all of these sort of subtleties, it's really hard to catch that yourself. Few and far between are those who can be that keyed in, who can be narrating and performing, but then also listening to what they're doing and comparing. Whereas when you have a director engineer on the other side of the glass, that's their whole job, is to watch that continuity. When you come back from lunch and you sit down and you're 3 inches away and you don't know, they're like, oh nope, mic position is wrong, let's match this up, and they'll keep you on point. We might adjust the settings on the audio gear as your voice changes throughout the day. So there's when you're looking at the top level of quality and that kind of consistency and sort of believability, directed sessions are very, very helpful with maintaining that.
Well, and this is something that we haven't talked about, the three of us, but years ago, I did a little bit of work with ACX, which is Amazon's pool of narrators. Basically, narrators bid on doing a project for free, and then you share the royalties. But what hits me as I'm listening to this is it's really risky, because you may get a person who's starting out, they may not be very good, they may not be the right fit, but they're the only narrator who will offer to do your book, to read your book. And so you're kind of stuck. So having somebody who matches you with the right fit for a narrator is really important. And but now let's talk about authors reading books. What are the pros and cons of authors narrating their own books?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest pro is that sense of connection, and oh, this is actually so and so talking about their life or sharing their passion for this discipleship idea or business idea. So I think the biggest pro is whatever the opposite of cognitive dissonance, cognitive assonance, I think. And that generally trumps the cons, because listeners are a lot more forgiving of an author because they know they're not a professional. So the spectrum of delivery styles and perfection, so to speak, is a lot more forgiving. That's also a pro when the author reads. The cons are you have to be in a studio for a chunk of time over several days, and for some people that's really tricky to schedule. You need to be somewhere that sounds good. You can't just set up a microphone in your living room. If you ever want to do an exercise, just sit at your kitchen table or in your office and be silent for 3 minutes and start to listen to all the sounds around you. Oh my. So getting yourself in a place that sounds good, whether that's a treated room in your own house or going to a studio or whatever, it's just scheduling, logistics. And then, yeah, it's just, as McKenzie was saying, it's very demanding. It's a lot of fun, but you got to be ready to work at it. And then we try to discern this on the front end, but it can be a con if somehow an author gets in and really can't hold up for that many hours a day, that many days in a row, whether their voice or just their delivery. When you're narrating, you're on a pretty thin mental edge of taking in the words on the page, processing them, spitting them out your mouth believably in a good flow. It's tiring. Generally, the authors that come in really enjoy it and are really exhausted and are really glad that they didn't try to do it themselves. So most of the cons are outweighed when you have a directed session and you have a director who can, if you're blurting it out super fast, they can slow you down. If you're reading so slow, you're trying to sound official, but you just sound bored, they can work with you to get your tone up, all of that. So when you're doing directed sessions in a good facility, there aren't too many cons, as long as you personally have the ability to spend that time and get that scheduled.
Well, what do you do if an author, they've written a book, they've worked hard on the book, they come out to the studio, they start reading, and you're listening and you're going, they're not selling the book, it's not working, they're not, maybe they aren't a fluid reader. What do you do about that?
Yeah, well, again, the goal is to catch that on the front end with the test read, so that if it's really going to hurt the product, we can diplomatically guide them to a better solution. It's a hard thing. Reading is a very personal thing. If we get to a point where it turns out, despite our best efforts, it's not going out great, we'll typically just work on the coaching, take the time we need. We always book extra time so that if we need to go really slow, especially on that first day, we can take extra time, maybe reread the intro in chapter 1. Once we're in a good flow by chapter 5, we do that regularly. So typically, my guys are able to coach folks and kind of inspire them, maybe even read a little bit for them and let them hear the difference. See how this is. That's part of the art of what our directors do, is how do I get inside this person's head, motivate them, encourage them, kind of call out the issues without just sending them into a spiral of discouragement. There's no one answer, but that is the art of what we do in these sessions.
Now, what if a person wants to record at home? And we've talked, you have an option for people recording at home. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I've got a mobile recording kit that's just some simple kind of industry standard equipment. And what I do is I ship that to people. I have them FaceTime me when they get it, and I'll walk them through the setup, which is pretty simple. But more than that, I'll have them turn the camera around and show me, all right, where are you planning on recording this? And we'll look at the room and we'll talk about, okay, set up in front of this bookshelf so that these books can absorb the sound. Don't set up over facing this big empty wall that's just going to slap back and create this echoey room sound. So we'll start on the front end with dialing in where are they going to record, coaching them through the mic technique so that you're minimizing that room sound. It sounds better here than back here, things like that. Then we have them record a test session, maybe 10, 15 minutes. And that's where if there's significant background noises, if they're just by a busy road and there's Mack trucks going by every 5 minutes, we're either going to have to bury ourselves deep in the house or this isn't going to work. And then typically we only do the mobile rig for short things, poetry books, collections of short stories. And so we'll always have them read everything twice. And then my engineers will listen through, and anything that was maybe a mistake they didn't catch, the truck drives by and they didn't stop, we'll pull from the other reading of that, and we'll it's called compiling. We'll comp together those 2 takes. And that's the best way of approximating the guided sessions in terms of being able to fly in from alternate takes to cover over mistakes or background noises. The longer the book, the harder this is to do, in terms of having to read everything twice and just time in front of the microphone where background noises, house noises can interfere.
Now, but you weren't present the whole time while they were recording the book.
No, with studios that are used to setting this up, you can do what's called remote direction, and you can zoom in and listen. You can't really hear the background noises so much. It's a connection like this, but you can at least coach the delivery. It's a bit of a clunky back and forth, but people will settle in. If you had someone who was tech savvy enough to set that up on their computer, there's just a lot of audio routing to do. So it's feasible, but I think probably a lower percentage of folks that would sort of have the savvy and the equipment to be able to do that whole setup for recording and a remote director patching in at home on their own laptop. So feasible, less likely. I would tend to lean towards finding a studio somewhere close to them, or just talking through like, hey, how about you just have a trip to Nashville, come for a couple days, go listen to some good country music, take a little vacation, and have a couple days to record.
Enjoy the restaurants.
Exactly.
I love the restaurants in Nashville. Go ahead, McKenzie.
If I could add on there, I was just going to say a lot of the reason why audiobook processes are the way they are, like we're explaining, is for efficiency of time and money. I saw we had a participant, John, ask in the chat, with a nonfiction book, what are your collective thoughts on having different narrators do different sections of the book? And I think this relates because the reason that most of the time you have, at least for fiction or nonfiction, for any book, you have one narrator, is first of all cost. To have to get someone else in the studio, that's extra coordination, that's extra work, that's another person that you have to, okay, once we get in the studio, we've got to calibrate them, we've got to make sure those two voices are in line and that the first person is not reading in a completely different stratosphere than the other one. Kind of those things John mentioned, like tone and just, yeah, there's a lot of subtleties going on in there. So that's one of the reasons I can think of. John, do you have anything to add there? Like why nonfiction books typically only have one narrator, or situations where they might have more than one?
Yeah, you're always going to lean towards efficiency. But we've done a lot of books over the years that had multiple narrators. The ones I'm thinking about specifically, there was a compilation of sermons. And so we didn't get a unique voice for each pastor, because that would have been, goodness, 20 different. I mean, that would have been ridiculous. But I think we had 4 people and we would rotate through. So you did get the feeling that these were different people, and male and female, things like that. We've done that for devotionals as well, just to provide an array. Streams in the Desert was one where it's just a compilation of quotes, ancient and modern, hymn lyrics, Bible verses. And so we would have, I think we had a set of maybe 5 narrators or 2, things like that. So that comes down to that pre-production. What's the vision for this book and what's going to be the best fit? The other situation where you might see multiple narrators is if there's a foreword written by someone else, you'll always want that to be a different voice. Ideally, you get that person to read it, but that can be a nightmare too if you were able to net somebody to write your foreword, but they're very busy. So oftentimes, me or one of my narrators will hop in and just read that foreword so that it's a different voice, but we don't have to coordinate with someone who's running around with a really busy schedule. Same thing with something like an afterword, or perhaps it's a book about marriage and mostly it's written from the guy's perspective, but then his wife chimes in with 2 chapters. Well, then we'll either bring her in or we'll cast a female for those chapters. And that's, yeah, we're very used to doing that kind of stuff. And that just all gets incorporated on the front end into the quote, into the production plan.
Well, even thinking through it from a publisher's perspective, if I were to have, you're going to run into continuity issues, I think, because people are expecting the same voice. And the same thing, you know, when you have multiple writers, I mean, if you have 2 authors writing a book and each one writes a different chapter, well, then you want 2 different voices. But if you have the same message and they're read by different people, I think it's going to mess them up. I think it's going to be this dissonance that they're going to find, and they're going to actually, it's going to be distracting. It's going to take them away from the audiobook.
Yeah. I saw a question pop up in the chat, like, do we help people with what sections to read? And yes, that's one of the things. I don't think of the things that I know to say out loud. That's a big part of the pre-production, is looking through the manuscript, what parts need to be read, what parts don't. Things like, say you're an author and you're reading your own book, you won't read the title itself. There's things called bumpers or credits or billboards that will go at the front and the end. So, and I usually do those. So, you're listening to the audio production of da-da-da by da-da-da, read by so-and-so, forward, read by John Behrens. And then at the end, you know, you've been listening to the audio production of this and that, you know, text copyright 2023 by da-da-da, production copyright. So those sort of details are covered by the credits. And then we'll look through and see, is there an epigraph? Is there a dedication? Do you want to read the acknowledgments? You don't have to, you can. Sometimes acknowledgments are conversational. Sometimes it's a list of 87 names that nobody really wants to hear. If there's an about the author, you pretty much never read those. If there's footnotes throughout the text, we'll also help navigate that. Sometimes those are just references. Sometimes they're additional information that we do want to incorporate. Those are the sort of the craft of adapting to audio that we're very handy with. And so when we take a manuscript in for that pre-production process, we'll be mapping that out, and anything that's not clear, we'll get with the author. Hey, how do you want to handle this? Do you want to just let these footnotes go, or do you want to try to incorporate them? All of that sort of stuff, so that whether it's a pro narrating it or whether it's the author themselves, by the time they get into the studio, they're 100% clear on what they're going to be reading, how it's going to flow, and there's no kind of questions by the time you get to the recording. And those decisions we can bring our recommendations, but our guideline is always, what do you want? What is your vision for this? This might be the typical thing, but if this whatever is really important to you, absolutely, then let's put it in and make it work.
Another reason why it hits me as I'm listening, why I'm working with professionals in an audiobook, is some people like to do their own thing. They want to do something innovative. And it's kind of like when you invent your own genre, you're not going to find an audience. If you're going to give people something that they're not expecting, I mean, way out there, you're going to actually drive the audience away. It's kind of like, we've got the Chicago Manual of Style in traditional publishing that Illumify uses. There's kind of I don't know if there's a written Chicago Manual of Style for audiobooks, but there's an understanding of how audiobooks work that is understood among professionals, that when a person buys an audiobook, it's not going to take them on a weird tangent that's going to actually repel them from the book rather than listening to it.
Yep.
So let's talk about, because we're going to open it up for questions in about 7 minutes, but talk to us about distribution. How do you distribute your audiobooks?
Yeah, and that's a really important part of the equation. So in terms of Nashville Audio Productions and what we do, we go from getting that first manuscript and all the prep, recording everything, all the way to finished audio masters that meet specs, and then we'll turn those in. We don't ourselves upload or do the distribution. And I mentioned at the beginning or earlier on, I almost universally recommend working with a third-party distributor. We partner with Authors Republic. They're great. They're very personal. You have a direct contact that you can ask your questions to. And so typically we will just send the files to the client and to the distributor. The distributor will start to upload them. And then if any issues come up, if something's out of spec for any reason, we'll just work with the distributor, maybe make a tweak and get it out. But the benefit is it's actually a lot of work to upload to different retailers, and some of them will not work with individuals. They'll only work with a bigger aggregator, whether a big publishing company or someone like Authors Republic or Findaway who has established that relationship with them. So if you're looking to get your audiobook out to all the main portals and then all the lesser ones, I mean, it could be a full-time job just for 3-4 weeks to get these relationships established. You're going to sign a contract with every retailer. You're going to have a sales portal with every retailer with your numbers. It gets pretty crazy. So a third-party distributor is typically going to take 20% of your royalties, and that's how they make their money. And in my view, that is a very good value to them handling all of that and them getting it out to places you wouldn't be able to get it yourself. I think Apple Books is one where they're just not going to talk to you if you're just Joe author.
So the question everybody's wondering, I know we just had a question on the chat box, what should a person expect to pay for a professional narrator and working with you to produce an audiobook?
Yeah, that is the question. I will say the most spitball figures is going to be $3,000 to $5,000. Just get that in your head. You're not going to be too far off from that. Obviously, the word count is the primary driver of cost. The longer it is, the more it costs. But all the things we've been talking about, are there multiple narrators? Is this fiction? Does this need to be really intensely cast? And are you going to need to pay for a narrator that brings like a significant skill set to the table? That's going to be a different price point. So I would say if you're going to read it yourself, and it's, I would say, a pretty typical nonfiction, 200 some pages, you're looking at $28,000 to $4,000 for your production. If you're going to pay a narrator for that, that's probably going to add about $1,000 to that. Again, totally depending on the word count, but just as a ballpark, just up it by $1,000 for hiring a pro to come in. And then I'm trying to think of other ways that price can be bumped around. If it is really topically intensive, that requires a ton of prep, that's going to be folded into the estimate. I myself have narrated like biographies of Tolstoy and Bonhoeffer, and we spent a lot of time looking up pronunciations and texting friends in Germany to get someone to read this dedication that was 8 sentences of pure German. So depending on your content, and think of perhaps it's a really, maybe it's a health book and there's just a ton of medical terminology. That's just going to add, that's going to balloon your prep time in a way. Or if it is something that needs to be multicast and that's really important to the vision, then yeah, you're going to be looking at that cost going up as you bring multiple narrators, multiple schedules, and then interleaving all of that to piece the book together. But by and large, most of the books folks are writing are going to be in that 200-ish page range. It's going to be nonfiction. It's going to be the author reading it one way or the other, and you're going to be looking at 3,000 to 5,000. And then again, if you need to hire a pro, just bump that up by another grand, and that's going to get you close.
Now, do you keep any royalties after you're done? I mean, like when it goes on, do you get anything back yourself, or is all your money up front?
No, the model I've built is no royalty share at all. I just want to do a good production, be paid for that, and then let you keep everything you get from that.
Right.
That's not the only way to do what I do as a company, but I've never had a desire to get into the royalty game, and I really like for people to keep what they make from it. If it blows up and succeeds, I want them to reap those benefits.
Who holds the rights from day one? Do you hold any of the rights, or is all the rights with the author?
All the rights are with the author, and we send out a work agreement that specifies that the term is work for hire project, and it clarifies this is work for hire. None of the rights are retained by the producer. They're all retained by the rights holder.
Well, you're actually kind of an audiobook equivalent to Illumify, the way that we work as well.
Yep.
So we've talked about cost. Now, how about royalties? Let's assume a person works with you. They work with that third-party distributor. Their audiobook is on Audible on Amazon. What percent royalties can they expect out of the retail price of their book?
Yeah. Well, if you're talking Audible is the worst. If you do an Audible exclusive distribution where it can't be sold anywhere else, you can't even sell it yourself, only Audible, they'll give you 40%. If you do non-exclusive, they give you 25%. So they are the worst of the worst. Spotify, Google Play, Apple Books, those are all right around 50%, 45, 50%. And that's pretty typical for the rest of the retail outlets. So generally that's what you're looking at. And then if you're using a third-party distributor, you just take the 20% out of that, and that's kind of what you're looking at.
Okay, so it's like 20% from the 50%, or from the 40%, or from the 25%.
Correct.
So who is the largest purveyor of audiobooks?
As far as retail outlets?
Yes.
The last I checked, it is still Audible, but their market share is decreasing. It used to be utterly dominant. I think now it's hovering closer to 50%. But it's slowly settling out as other players like Spotify and Google Play and Apple Books. The field is starting to even back out. But yeah, Audible is still the king, just by not as much.
Good.
Also, I was going to say, Mike, we've got a couple more questions in the Q&A box, if we would like to go ahead and answer those.
Well, let's open it up for questions. So while
Sure.
McKenzie, while you're leading the way on this, if you have other questions, go ahead and type it into the chat box, and McKenzie will read the questions.
Absolutely. So Rob has asked, my book is only 115 pages. It's a nonfiction story of my life and spiritual battles. Is it worth going Audible? Thank you. And I think maybe what Rob is asking there, is it worth making into an audiobook? And John, would you like to take away that one?
Yeah, and if we're taking that wrong, feel free to correct us in the chat. But assuming going Audible means putting an audiobook out, I would say yeah, especially if it's your own story. There are lots of people who will not read a paper book, but who voraciously devour audiobooks. So if you want that story to get out to as many people as possible, yes, I would say it's worth doing an audiobook. If it's all about just recouping costs, then you have to think about that. So much of this is done for the love of it and for getting the message out that is it didn't used to be key to have an audiobook to get that message out, and that's what's changed over the last 10 years. Is it's borderline expected, and especially if it's your own story, to read that and let people hear it. There are going to be people who will read the book and then want to listen to the audiobook to hear you tell it in your own words, in your own voice. So yeah, I would say yes, and your production costs are going to be a little bit lower too, just because it's short.
Well, so to your point, you've got to divide, if it's 50% of your cost, if it's $4,000, that means you need to sell 2,000 audiobooks. But the thing to remember, and this is where, and McKenzie was really helpful for me in this, is seeing how the audiobook industry is exploding. The estimates that I found, or maybe McKenzie, you turned me on to 25% a year between 2020 and 2030. So you released an audiobook now, it's going to be available as this market mushrooms, and it keeps your book relevant. And then the other thing, and I talked to somebody yesterday who said her husband's dyslexic. He can't read books. There's people who are deaf, and what did I find? Like 50 million people in America are unable to read books because either their brain isn't cooperating or they can't read because they're blind. So all of a sudden, this is going to be opening up to this number of people too. So is it a risk? Absolutely. What isn't a risk? What significant isn't a risk? And so, you may sell, it may take 3 or 4 years to pay off your investment, but your audiobook is out there. There's a lot of books that don't have an audiobook, so the competition is much smaller. So anyway, McKenzie, do you have another question for us?
Yes. Anne has asked about the costs for distribution, which I think we've gone into a little bit. And also wanted to bring up, just in case we didn't mention it before, that when you go with Illumify and we're contracting with John at Nashville Audio Productions, Nashville Audio Productions gets a special rate with Authors Republic. I hope I'm allowed to share that, John. But that's a benefit of going with us and with this program, is that not only are you getting the expertise and the consultation, but you are actually saving money on the distribution costs because you guys are a preferred partner.
Yep. Yeah. And again, the industry standard rate for a third-party distributor is 20% of the royalties coming in. And if you just show up at someone's doorstep, you probably won't get that. But with the partner relationship we have, that's where you're going to be at.
Definitely. Greg has also asked, what would be the typical time frame for a nonfiction book to be prepped and produced? Which I think time frame is an interesting question and something that we should bring up overall. Turnaround time for, okay, today I want to turn my book into an audiobook. When can I expect it to be out?
Yeah. So typically so I'm going to talk, ignoring the pre-production at first, because that's out of our hands. But once we have the manuscript, we've communicated, we've set the vision and all of that, it's a month is very typical, and that can be contracted if someone really needs to get something to market. Last month we turned a book around in a week. I'm not saying we can do that for everyone, but the author was right here in town. She'd done many audiobooks before. She showed up, knocked it out, and it wasn't super long either. But typically a month from starting recording to delivery is more than enough time. And if someone's motivated and available, has the manuscript in hand, is ready to just answer questions, sort it all out, sign the work agreement, turn in the down payment, and just get moving, the pre-production really only needs to take about a week. So yeah, our team is built around being able to turn things around pretty quickly when we need to. Because some folks will come to us later in the game, like, oh my goodness, my book is releasing in June. I just now realized I need to have an audiobook. Can we make this happen? Usually the answer is yes.
Pretty quick. It's faster than publishing.
Yeah. And that's faster than most audiobook producers. It's one of the things that we're proud of, is we can really move quickly on things, and our team is used to that.
And McKenzie, I don't know if you're looking at the chat box, because there's some really good questions. One thing I'll just jump in. So audiobooks, are they very prevalent among like middle schoolers?
That's a great question. I would say yes, it is definitely increasing popularity pretty much for almost all ages. I know many parents who play audiobooks for their kids in the car. It's not just good for road trips, it's good for commuting to and from school and activities. Also, there's babysitters, nannies, parents who will turn on audiobooks while watching children, and they listen to it that way, and it's an activity that, oh, you can color and listen. I would say 8 to 12. That popularity is probably only going to go up, especially with the popularity of smartphones and kids that age having their own iPhone and having probably an Audible subscription under their parent. And just being able to, oh, I like this author, or I want to check out this book, and being able to access it like that. Because you mentioned how much faster the process is. It's also just a faster getting it in your hands or in your ear process for audiobooks, because it's available on streaming. You can have it anytime right there, and it's not going to run out. Many people can be listening. So
That's great.
and it looks like David has asked, can changes be made in the print manuscript for the audiobook, especially if the book is printed on demand?
I'm assuming that means sort of revising the print manuscript if you find things in the audiobook process. Yes, and typically we'll find things as we do the audiobook because you're forced to crawl through it in a different way. If I could wave my magic wand and make a rule, my rule would be no book can be published until the author has read the whole thing out loud, because you will discover things that your eyes will gloss over, whether it's just simple typos or realizing, oh man, I said the same thing 3 times in this paragraph, or that's kind of a clunky way of saying it. So yeah, often we will tweak things as we go when we're working with the author. When it's a professional narrator, you're there to just read the text, but we will often turn in a list of typos and things just as a good faith. Hey, if you got another revision coming out or it's print on demand, here's what we found. People are always very appreciative of that. And yeah, when it's the author involved, you've kind of, the sky's the limit on what you might want to tweak.
Right.
Absolutely. And to that point, there's been issues. There have been instances of audiobooks being revamped, right, John? Like being re-recorded. Additionally, like say there's just so many changes, or it's an updated text. Sometimes it gets re-recorded, or like say it's a really, really old book. Like take Dune, for example. I'm sure there's a really, really old audiobook recording of Dune, and then there's a recent one coming out, probably with Timothée Chalamet or somebody, reading it. So
Yep.
it's one of those things where, like, if there's a market for it, most likely, you can do multiple versions.
Yep.
McKenzie, why don't you read the next question from Jamie?
Jamie, we've got, for a fiction book with several characters, how do you decide who is the best fit for the read? Do you familiarize yourself with the story and author's voice and then choose from your sources? Do readers audition so the author can hear a sample reading?
Yeah. Generally, it comes down to talking with the author first. What's your vision? How do you picture these people in your head? Again, sussing out your core definitive, just age, gender, ethnicity, accent, and then overall sort of tonality, I guess. And then usually once I have a sense of that, that's when I'll give a few pitches, because you can talk about it all day, but you just have to hear stuff. So typically I'll try to pitch existing material just to streamline the process. But depending on the content of the book we're working on, I may have people record auditions of the stuff specifically, especially for fiction. May have them record some so you can hear both their delivery and their voices. If you want to make sure Mabel's voice is exactly right, well then you need people to voice it. In which case the narrator will read enough to get a sense of the character in the book, and then just usually a voice memo on their phone. You don't care about the quality, you just need to hear their voice. And so, yeah, sometimes we'll use the audition process, try to see if we can avoid it to save everyone time. But professional narrators are used to doing that. They audition for stuff all the time, so they're used to that. And I've done that many times. Nope, you're muted.
This has been very helpful. I'm going to toss a softball to both of you. What advice would you give an author who's considering turning their book into an audiobook? What advice would you give them?
I can go first. I would say that as a consumer of audiobooks myself, it's worth it. You know, especially if you're working with Illumify, you're publishing your book. In today's day and age, audiobooks are only going up. And maybe that wouldn't have happened if COVID hadn't happened the way it did, but they basically exploded. It was one of the only segments of the publishing industry that grew during 2020 when everything else was down. And basically people consume audio content a lot now because there's so many more ways to consume it. You know, you can do it while multitasking. Also, just the experience of hearing your book. It's processed by your brain in a different way. You know, Mike talked about visually impaired readers or dyslexic readers who, you know, they want to consume books just like the rest of us. And now there's just more and more opportunity for them to be able to do that. So as far as the cost goes, I would say it's really worth your time. It's also something that it's out there. You know, you can still be receiving royalties, you know, years from now, right? Like maybe it will take a year or so to recoup that investment, but it is going to come. And especially if you're building your platform as an author, I think it's really invaluable to have an audiobook that's a professional production.
And can I add to that for you? Because this is what hit me. This is why I wasn't on board 100% for audiobooks until not very long ago. I have a daughter who never reads, but she listens to podcasts all day long. Actually, when she's sleeping, she has a podcast going. Well, audiobooks are perfect for people who are like my 27-year-old daughter, because it's going to reach people who just will never read another book. But this is something she will listen to. And the market, and what's happening is older people like me are aging out who aren't as attuned to audiobooks. And this younger generation that's used to the audio thing, this market is growing into. This is why it's going to grow, because my daughter's going to become 30, 40, 50. And this new generation that has grown up with audio, now it's going to be, that's why it's growing so big. That's why I'm so sold on it. So John, I'll give you a couple of minutes and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I'd say gone are the days where it was a niche option. And if I were going to advise someone who was in the process of starting to write a book and beginning that whole birthing process, I would just say include the audiobook along with everything else that you're doing, graphics and formatting and print on demand setup and all. Just build it in from the get-go. Take it as a part of the process, and start to think about that as you write it. That's going to help you if you've already written it. Try not to get behind. The sooner in the process you think about it, the less likely you are to get in that state of, oh shoot, I just realized I need an audiobook. So yeah, my advice would be think about it from the get-go. If at all possible, incorporate it immediately into your budgeting, your expectations, and then just think through, try to think through as clear-headedly as you can whether you want to read it yourself and let yourself be honest about it, because it's not for everyone. We all think we should be able to, but it's not necessarily for everyone. So just try to come at it from holding it out in front of you and looking at it. What is going to serve the book best? Try not to be married to, I must read it or I must have X. But you know, if you partner with someone like us, we can connect with your vision and help guide you on what are the pros and cons of various production choices. And the more that you're able to have your clear vision, but then be open-handed about the details, the quicker and more efficiently we can settle on a production plan that's going to make the best use of your time and money and get you what's in your head, get it out into the world. It's something that you're going to be really proud of. Oh, and then McKenzie, you touched on this, but I just want to kind of reinforce the publishers that I've talked with about this. They described audiobook sales as evergreen. as opposed to print sales. They just sort of go and basically trickle for years and years and years and years. And so that's a real cool benefit of getting an audiobook out there, is that's going to be passive income coming in kind of forever till the world blows up. So I think that's a nice positive to remember in the process, that this will be out there and it will sell more consistently and longer in general than print books.
Wow, so informative. I'm so grateful for both of you, John and McKenzie. Just really appreciate it. I just want to review, if you're interested in getting an audiobook, just want to remind you, you want to schedule a strategy session with me, publishingpossibilities.com. It takes you to my online calendar, and just you can fill in information. I do have time next week, but please sign up for that. And I want to thank you all for being a part of this today. This has been great. I'm just very, it's just been very helpful. And so thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.